As Mehmet described, I am a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Adelaide. Although my current research is about boundary layer control, my today's presentation is about a topic that I explored in my PhD, which is on insect wings. And there is a long debate which was going on regarding the optimum aspect ratio of insect wings. So the whole presentation is about that. So a brief description about my own career. So I have obtained my bachelor's and master's from India, and my PhD is from Monash University. And between every 2 degrees, I have some industrial experience. And now I'm a postdoctoral researcher. Previously, I was with Monash and now with University of Adelaide. So between all of these different opportunities, what was a common thread was actually my interest into fluid mechanics and vortex dynamics. So basically my PhD thesis was about insect wing aerodynamics. And although it sounded very funny and also interesting at the same time, most people, when I talked to them about insect wing aerodynamics, they thought that I would be doing this in my PhD, catching insects. And this is what I actually did. So I did experiments on a real model, not real insects, but a model of an insect wing inside a laboratory environment. So, but in this presentation today, I'm not talking about my experiments, but it's mostly on my computational work. I'll come to that forward. So now talking about this topic, insect wing aerodynamics. Probably many of us may not know that flying is very common in nature. This is because nearly 75% of the animal species, they are flying animals. So they include both insects and birds. And they fly at different Reynolds numbers. So insects fly at lower Reynolds numbers and they flap their wings at very high frequency. Then the birds fly at slightly intermediate Reynolds numbers where their flapping frequency is smaller. And then we all fly in aeroplanes with very high Reynolds numbers and they have fixed wings. So depending on the parameters or the Reynolds number that we fly, the flying mechanism changes. So here is the mechanism used by insects. So when we think about flapping, we usually think it's an up and down stroke, but it's not so in insects. It's basically a forward and backward stroke. And peculiarly in insects, they generate lift in both the half strokes. So in forward as well as the backward half stroke. If you see the figure on the right, you'll see that the wings maintain a very high angle of attack, and they rotate in a major part of a stroke. They rotate with a nearly constant angular velocity. So this part of the stroke, the middle part of the stroke, is called the rotational translation. And at the end of a half stroke, the wing flips and it changes its orientation. So the major part, that is the rotational translation, is what is very essential in insects, because that is when they generate most of the lift. And this study is important because the recent developments in the MAVs have developed very small MAVs like these shown here, which have wings smaller than even 1 cent coin. So, so now briefly talking about the vortex or the lift generation mechanism here. Now it has been widely accepted that a stable leading edge vortex formed on a wing is important for a stable lift. The leading edge vortex is actually formed by the flow separating at the leading edge of the wing that curves behind, and it forms a vortex. In terms of a translating wing, a linearly translating wing, we all are aware that there is a Kalman vortex shading, there is a growth and shading of the vortices, but it's not so in the rotating wings. In fact, in this case, the vortex is formed on the wing and then it grows in size. It looks more conical, so it's smaller near the wing root and larger towards the wing tip. and beyond a certain rotation phase, it remains stable in size and also remains attached to the wing. And this is on account of this the span-wise vorticity transport, which actually uh, carries the additional vorticity fed by the leading edge towards the wingtip. So if you see the schematic on the left, it will show the span-wise transport of the vorticity, and the additional vorticity is left behind from the wingtip. So that's how the vortex size is remain stable. So if you look at the lift coefficient, that also remains stable beyond a certain rotation angle. So here is a video showing a wing rotating with a, so it initially starts from rest and then rotates with a constant angular velocity. So when it accelerates, there is a peak in the lift coefficient, and beyond a certain time, the lift remains stable. And the same can be observed with the circulation around the leading edge vortex at different time intervals or different phases of rotation. So this shows that the stable leading edge vortex is important. Now, let's look at the terminology associated with the insect wings. Aspect ratio is the ratio of wingspan to the mean wing chord. The Reynolds number in this case is a little bit different from what we define in terms of bluff body flows. So in those cases, we have a flow over a bluff body where we consider the velocity coming onto the bluff body to be the reference. Whereas in this case, we are considering a normal hovering insect, which means there is no oncoming flow, but the velocity is that of the wing itself. So here UG is the velocity of the wing at its radius of gyration, RG. Then that's multiplied by the mean wing chord and divided by the kinematic viscosity. The Rossby number is important as well, because here we have a rotating reference frame of the wing, and there is rotational flow inside the leading edge vortex. So because of that, there is a Coriolis acceleration. So Rossby number is basically a ratio of Coriolis force and inertial force. So in this context of insect wings, it's a ratio of two length scales, radius of gyration and the mean wing chord. Probably we may not require this wing root offset to be discussed here, but it's basically required in terms of experimental models which slightly offset their wings from the rotational axis. Well, so if we look at the wings available in nature, you'll see that there's a very wide variety. So there are many insect species, and their wings are very different from each other. They're narrow as well as wider wings, meaning their aspect ratios are very different. If we categorize all of them in terms of the Reynolds number, then the first figure shows that on the plane of Reynolds number and aspect ratio, we have a very small range of aspect ratios in the lower Reynolds number range. And if we go up towards a higher Reynolds number, then we observe a very wide variety. Although I acknowledge that this is because of, this might be limited to whatever source of information that I have here based on the data set. But still, you will observe that smaller insects like beetles, flies have very small aspect ratios. And if you go up, if you see larger insects, probably mosquitoes or even the dragonflies, they have all range of aspect ratios. So it's hard to understand what is optimum in this case. And the second geometrical parameter is R2 hat, which is actually the moment of the radius of the second moment of inertia of the wing, normalized by the wingspan. And this is widely observed. I mean, there is not too much variance. It's basically observed between 0.5 and 0.6. So all the insects on insect wings are within this range. So the most variation is observed in aspect ratios. So many aspect ratio studies have been conducted in the past, both experimentally as well as computationally. Here is a study by Crute et al., where they have performed experiments on wings of different aspect ratios. And they see that the leading edge vortex grows in size from the wing root to the wingtip. And beyond a certain aspect ratio, for example, beyond this line shown by 4, aspect ratio of 4, you'll see that this leading edge vortex is lifted up away from the surface. That will actually affect the lift coefficient of the wing. And that's what they observed. So in the figure D over here, the black line shows that the lift coefficient has gone up until the aspect ratio of 4, and then it starts going down. So therefore, they concluded from their study that aspect ratio of 4 is optimum. In the numerical study by Garman and Wisbel, they looked at the vertical structure on different aspect ratios. And the smaller aspect ratios showed a single coherent vortex, whereas a larger aspect ratios had 2 co-rotating vortices, and there is a growth and bursting of some vortex into non-coherent structures. So this is detrimental for the lift acting on the wing. And therefore, this shows that lower aspect ratios might be better for lift coefficient. And another study, which was done by Han et al., they perform experiments for different rotating wings, and at the same span-wise location, the smaller aspect ratio showed the leading edge vortex closer to the wing surface and smaller in size, but larger aspect ratios showed that it's lifted up from the surface, again meaning that lower aspect ratios might be better. So, and then apart from that, there are several other studies which have actually measured the lift coefficient or predicted using numerical methods, and they have presented their trends, and they are all over. So every trend is different. If you can see in the first figure over here. So if we have to choose any one particular aspect ratio as an optimum one, it's hard to choose because all the trends look different, and it's hard to believe which one is it's hard to understand which one is more believable. So this is a problem for the designers of MAVs. And again, it's also a problem of the reference. So in the first picture, the reference is the velocity, the wing velocity at a radius of gyration. But instead of that, if we use the wing tip velocity, then the picture changes. So the second picture shows the trends based on the normalization with wing tip velocity. And again, here, there's no one collapse. So they all are again different. So this perhaps might be because of coupling effects with some other parameters. And that's what was the focus of our study. And before that, I'll talk about 2 different studies here. So first study was done by Harbig et al. From Monash University. So Rob Harbig was actually studying the effect of Reynolds number and aspect ratio, both of them. And he observed one interesting thing here. So if you look at the first row here, there's a fruit fly wing rotating at 2 different Reynolds numbers, and smaller Reynolds numbers show a single coherent vortex splitting after it reaches after it merges with the tip vortex. So it looks very smooth. Whereas if you look at the second picture here, the higher Reynolds number, the vortex is splitting much inward, and the second vortex, LEV2, grows in size, and then it bursts into small non-coherent structures. So this was the effect of Reynolds number. Now, in the second line, just below that, this is his numerical predictions for vertical structures of 2 different aspect ratios, but both rotating at RE of 120. So one would expect that both the wings should have single coherent structure, but it's not true. Even at higher aspect ratio, we observe the splitting of the vortex and bursting, similar to the higher Reynolds number. So that's why he thought that there are coupled effects of aspect ratio and Reynolds number. Now, there was another study by Lee et al. From Singapore, where they observed the coupled effects between aspect ratio and Rossby number. So here, Rossby number is basically changed by changing the radius of gyration in two different ways. So in the first set shown here at the top schematic, the aspect ratio is changed by stretching the wing in the spanwise direction, whereas in the second set, the aspect ratio is changed by compressing the wing in the chordwise direction. And because they have non-zero offset from the wing root, the radius of gyration in the two sets are different, that they change by different ratios. And therefore, when you change the aspect ratio, the Rossby number also automatically changes in different ways. And depending on how you choose both of them together, you obtain a different trend. So they actually perform many numerical tests changing both aspect ratio and Rossby number, and they obtain this contour map of lift coefficient on the plane of these two parameters. And then you'll be able to see how your lift coefficient might vary depending on how you vary both of them together. So now we have come to know that aspect ratio, Reynolds number, and Rossby number, these all are, they have coupled effects. So basically, this is what we observed from the literature, that the effects of aspect ratios are coupled with RE and RO. The optimized aspect ratio might differ with Reynolds number. Most experimental models use non-zero offset for their central bodies, so their Rossby number will change, and therefore there are coupled effects of all of the three parameters. And then we thought that the curious case of an optimum aspect ratio should be related to these unknown combined effects of these parameters. And then we decided to explore the individual and the combined effects of all of them and try to reconcile previous studies if possible. So I'll discuss what I did here. So this particular study was mostly done using computational method, where we rotated a wing situated at the center of a cylindrical domain shown here with a uniform angular speed starting from rest. And we stopped it at 270 degrees of rotation. This was solved, the Navier-Stokes equations in a rotating frame of reference were solved using ANSYS CFX 18.2. And this is the kind of hybrid mesh that we used in the model. So basically, starting with the first parameter, that is the Reynolds number. First, I'll show what Rob Harvick had observed in his results. So he was first looking at the point at which the leading edge vortex splits into two co-rotating vortices. So that the variation of that split point as a function of Reynolds number is shown here in this figure. So when we increase the Reynolds number, that point comes closer to the wing root. And if we change the wing with a different aspect ratio, then the curve is different. So this means that the split happens at different point if we choose different aspect ratios. Now, what he did is he tried to rescale the Reynolds number using the wing span instead of the wing chord as the length scale. And then he observed that all of these three curves collapse approximately on a single curve. So what this means is, if we choose any span-based Reynolds number, then all of these wings split at the same location. So they should have a similar vertical structure. And then I actually ran those simulations, and figured out that that's indeed true. So the first column here showing the vertical structures, the first column shows 3 different aspect ratios rotating at lower Reynolds number with a single vertical structure. And the second column shows the same wings at a higher span-based Reynolds number. And you will see that they all split nearly at the same location. So vertical structures are similar. And because they are stabilized by the span-wise vorticity flux, the wingspan is more important parameter relevant to this vortex rather than the wing chord. So now we have started using the span-based definition of the Reynolds number in the context of insect wings, because we have found that this is more relevant. And we also explored the effects on the lift coefficient with that. So let us start with a lower Reynolds number case. So this red line shows REB of 300. At a small aspect ratio, you will see that there is a large leading edge vortex formed, and beneath that these are pressure contours developed on the suction surface responsible for the lift. Now, when we increase the aspect ratios, the chord is actually smaller, which means the leading edge vortex covers a larger area of the wing, the larger portion of the area. And then we have the pressure which is redistributed on the surface, and the lift coefficient remains similar. But beyond a certain aspect ratio, the chord is so small that the vortex covers a very major portion of the area, and there are counter effects from the trailing edge vortex. And that actually, those are detrimental to the suction magnitude acting on the surface. And therefore, the lift coefficient is in fact reduced. And if we further keep reducing the wing chord to increase the aspect ratio, then the lift coefficient keeps reducing further. So this is at a lower Reynolds number, which has very large vertical structure. Now, what happens with a larger Reynolds number, REB of 4000? Now here, although we have a strong vortex, it is very compact. So most of the suction pressure is concentrated beneath this vortex, very close to the leading edge. And you will see that major part of the wing, which is not beneath the vortex, has negligible suction pressure. So it's not contributing much to the lift anyway. So in this case, when we reduce the chord, then that portion which is not contributing to the lift is actually reduced, and therefore there is a very slight increase in the lift coefficient. And because this vortex is much compact, we have more area to play with. So again, with a higher aspect ratio, there is still improvement in the lift coefficient. But now when we reach the aspect ratio of 5, the leading edge vortex is almost touching the trailing edge, which means that beyond this point, there will be effects from the detrimental effects from the trailing edge. And that's what we observed. So a higher aspect ratio show lower lift coefficient, and then further it goes on reducing. So now if we do this exercise for a range of Reynolds numbers, we obtain these different curves. So here I have shown the area on the left with a color, meaning that in this area, we have either similar or slightly better lift coefficient with an increasing aspect ratio. So we can call that this region is this region can be called as an optimal aspect ratios just in terms of lift. I know there are other functions, the power economy, and also the biomechanical aspects of it, which are important for a wing. But purely based on lift, we can call this portion as an optimum region. So it's not just single optimum aspect ratio, but it's a range of aspect ratios. And that changes based on Reynolds number. So at lower Reynolds number, we have very small range. And when we go up in the Reynolds number, we have larger range of aspect ratios sitting in this colored region. And very interestingly, the insect wings in nature are found to be in this region. So the fruit flies are at lower Reynolds number over here, and crane flies and beetles, they fly nearly at similar Reynolds numbers, but their aspect ratios are way different from each other. And this can perhaps explain why we have a wide variety of aspect ratios in nature. Well, now since we have found that the span-based Reynolds number explains well the effect of aspect ratios and the leading edge vortex structure, we revisited the Navier-Stokes equations in a rotating frame of reference, and then scaled the length scale based on the wingspan instead of the chord. So now at the bottom, it's the normalized Navier-Stokes equation, and you'll see the last colored term over here. It is scaled with rho UGB on mu, which is nothing but the span-based Reynolds number. Now, before that, there is 2 on RG on B. This particular RG on B term is actually normalizing the Coriolis term, the omega cross U, and which means that this should be actually the Rossby number instead of RG on C that is traditionally used. So we also tried to verify that. So at the top, there are 2 different aspect ratios rotating at the same Reynolds number and the same RG on C. So RG on C is the traditional definition of the Rossby number. And you can see the vertical structures are totally different. But now, if you look at the first column up and down, these are rotating at same RG on B, the span-based Rossby number. So this is what we have now proposed, and with these Rossby numbers, the vertical structures are again similar. And and the reason behind that is, if we have to maintain a constant RG on C, then when we change the aspect ratio, the chord is actually changed. So if we increase the chord, we have to increase RG as well. That means we have to move the wing away from its rotation axis. And that actually affects the Coriolis acceleration, and therefore it has a different vertical structure. Whereas if we have to maintain constant RG on B, then there is no effect on the wing offset, and therefore the Coriolis terms in the 2 cases should be similar, and therefore the vertical structure is similar, and that's what we observed. And so finally, we have the span-based Reynolds number and span-based Rossby number and aspect ratio. So we varied these 3 parameters independently and then obtained the variation in the lift coefficient as a function of all of them. So these are the ranges that we used. These basically covered most insects. And based on these predictions, we derived a polynomial model to predict the lift coefficient. And we used that model to actually predict the trends based on the AR, REP, and ROB from the literature. So we looked at all these papers here, and the solid lines show their own predictions, and the dashed lines shows the predictions using our polynomial model. And if apart from a few exceptions, such as this light blue line here, which is from Usherwood and Ellington, most of them show similar trends and very little bit deflection from their actual values. We can even explain the differences that are observed here. So basically, Usherwood and Ellington did experiments at very high Reynolds numbers. That was 25,000, which was much beyond our range. And also some of the experiments correspond to different angle of attack. So there will be some additional effect, which can be explored further. But anyway, this shows why we have different trends, because there were combined effects of all of these parameters, which were probably not taken into consideration. But this model can reconcile all those effects. So this study was published in parts. So previously, Harvik started this, and then I continued with the group there, and then we have these three publications more relevant to the things that are presented today. So I'll just summarize based on this. So basically, we observed that optimum aspect ratios have been debated in the past. Several studies in the past have conflicting trends in the lift coefficient. And those studies also use wing chord as the reference scale, and that is basically motivated from the wings of the large flyers. And previous and the current study also shows that the effects of Reynolds and Rossby numbers are coupled with the aspect ratio effects, and those can be decoupled using wingspan as more relevant scale to the insect wing aerodynamics instead of the chord. So our modified scaling of Reynolds and Rossby numbers help reconcile those seemingly conflicting trends. And with this, we have attempted to conclude the debate around the optimum aspect ratio. So at the end, I would like to note that this modified scaling that we have proposed might be limited to certain ranges of the Reynolds numbers and certain aspect ratios, because we all know that for airplanes and large flyers, wing chord is relevant, and we can't deny that. So there should be some transition between this assumption and the wing chord length scale. So it might require further study to explore what happens actually when there's a transition. So right, so with that, I think I'll conclude my talk, and I thank all of you for being here in this presentation and patiently listening to me, and I'll be happy to take if you have any questions.